In the quiet suburb of Maplewood, a picturesque neighborhood nestled on the outskirts of Chicago, tragedy was about to unfold. The community was tight-knit, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, or so they thought. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect environment, secrets simmered, secrets that would soon explode in a shocking act of violence. Isabella Martinez was the kind of woman everyone admired. At 33, she had built a life many envied, a successful career as a nurse, a charming husband, Carlos Martinez, and 2 beautiful children. Her home was the epitome of suburban bliss, a well-kept garden, a cozy interior, and a reputation for hosting the best neighborhood barbecues. Carlos, a dedicated firefighter, was known for his bravery and kindness. He often worked long hours, leaving early in the morning and returning late at night, exhausted but content, knowing he was providing for his family. He loved Isabella deeply, though their time together had become increasingly rare as his work demands grew. Isabella's cousin, Marissa, had been her best friend since childhood. They shared everything from their earliest memories to their deepest secrets. Marissa, married to Gabriel Perez, was a stay-at-home mum, raising their 3 children in a house just a few blocks from Isabella's. The 2 families were inseparable, attending church together, celebrating holidays, and relying on each other for support. But as the years passed, Isabella found herself growing increasingly lonely. Carlos was always working, and while she understood the importance of his job, the emotional distance between them began to gnaw at her. Their conversations were brief, often limited to discussions about the children or household logistics. The passion that once burned so brightly in their marriage had faded to embers. During this time, Isabella began to notice Gabriel in a different light. Gabriel was the opposite of Carlos, charismatic, charming, and always ready with a smile or a kind word. He had a way of making Isabella feel special, something she hadn't felt in years. It started innocently enough, casual conversations at family gatherings, lingering glances that lasted a moment too long, and eventually, flirtatious exchanges that were impossible to ignore. As the weeks turned into months, the chemistry between Isabella and Gabriel became undeniable. They found reasons to be alone together, running errands, picking up the kids from school, or simply sharing a coffee when Marissa was busy. What began as harmless fun quickly evolved into something far more dangerous. By early 2019, Isabella and Gabriel had embarked on a passionate affair. They were careful, meeting in secret whenever they could, always ensuring that no one would suspect a thing. The thrill of the forbidden added to their excitement, making each encounter more intense than the last. For Isabella, Gabriel was a breath of fresh air, a reminder that she was still desirable, still alive. But as their relationship deepened, so did the risks. The guilt weighed heavily on Isabella, who loved her husband despite their growing distance. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but she couldn't stop herself. The more she tried to pull away, the more she was drawn back into Gabriel's arms. Everything came to a head on the night of March 12, 2019. Carlos had left for his overnight shift, and the children were at a sleepover. Isabella had planned to meet Gabriel at a secluded spot they often visited, a small clearing in the woods just outside town. But as she prepared to leave, a sense of dread washed over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Ignoring her instincts, Isabella drove to the meeting spot. When she arrived, Gabriel was already there, waiting for her. They embraced, but the usual spark between them was dimmed by the tension that hung in the air. As they talked, Isabella's doubts grew stronger. She told Gabriel that she wanted to end the affair, that she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Gabriel didn't take the news well. His charm disappeared, replaced by anger and desperation. He accused Isabella of leading him on, of making promises she couldn't keep. The argument escalated quickly, with both of them saying things they didn't mean, the passion that had once fueled their relationship now turning into something darker. In a fit of rage, Gabriel grabbed Isabella's arm, pulling her close. She tried to push him away, but he was too strong. As their struggle intensified, Gabriel's hand found a rock lying on the ground. In a moment of blind fury, he struck Isabella on the head. She fell to the ground, blood pooling beneath her. The realization of what he had done hit Gabriel like a ton of bricks. Panic set in. He had to cover up his crime, had to make sure no one would ever know. Gabriel hurriedly dragged Isabella's lifeless body deeper into the woods, concealing her among the dense underbrush. He wiped the blood from his hands and returned to his car, his mind racing with fear and regret. As he drove away, he couldn't believe what had just happened. The woman he had once adored was now dead, and it was all his fault. The next morning, Carlos returned home after his shift, expecting to find Isabella making breakfast as usual. but the house was eerily quiet. The kids had already left for school, and Bella's car was still parked in the driveway. He called her name, but there was no response. As he moved through the house, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. After searching every room, Carlos began to panic. He called Isabella's phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. He reached out to Marisa, asking if she had seen or heard from Isabella, but Marisa had no idea where she was. Growing more frantic, Carlos contacted the police and reported Isabella missing. Detective Maria Alvarez, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp instincts, was assigned to the case. She arrived at the Martinez home later that afternoon, gathering details from Carlos and scanning the surroundings for anything out of the ordinary. Carlos's genuine distress was clear, but as a detective, Alvarez knew that no one could be ruled out until the facts were laid bare. The investigation kicked off with a search of the neighborhood. Officers combed through the area, questioning neighbors and looking for any signs of Isabella. Flyers were posted, and news of her disappearance spread quickly through the community. As days passed with no sign of Isabella, her family's hope began to wane. Marisa was devastated, unable to fathom what had happened to her cousin. She and Gabriel helped Carlos with the children, doing their best to support him through the nightmare. But Gabriel was distant, his demeanor unusually tense. He avoided eye contact with Marisa and was often on his phone, pacing the backyard at odd hours. On March 17th, 5 days after Isabella went missing, a hiker stumbled upon her body in the woods. The scene was grim. Isabella's face was bruised, and her hair was matted with blood. The authorities were immediately called, and Detective Alvarez arrived to take charge of the investigation. The discovery of Isabella's body shifted the case from a missing persons search to a homicide investigation. Alvarez and her team meticulously examined the crime scene, looking for any clues that might lead them to the killer. The lack of defensive wounds suggested that Isabella hadn't fought back, indicating that her attacker had caught her off guard. Back at the police station, Alvarez began piecing together Isabella's final hours. Phone records revealed a flurry of messages between Isabella and an unknown number on the day she died. The messages were vague, full of innuendo and plans to meet, but they were enough to suggest an affair. Alvarez's suspicions grew stronger as she traced the number back to Gabriel Perez. When questioned, Gabriel initially denied everything, claiming that he had been at home with Marisa the night Isabella died. He painted a picture of a man devastated by the loss of a close family member, but Alvarez wasn't convinced. Gabriel's story was filled with inconsistencies and his alibi was shaky at best. Detective Alvarez pressed harder, confronting Gabriel with the phone records. As the evidence piled up, Gabriel's facade began to crumble. He confessed to the affair, admitting that he and Isabella had been involved for months. However, he insisted that he had nothing to do with her death. He claimed that he had left Isabella alive in the woods after their argument and that he was as shocked as anyone to hear she had been found dead. Despite his denials, Alvarez knew that Gabriel's actions were far from innocent. The timeline of events placed him at the scene around the time of Isabella's death, and his panicked behavior during questioning only fueled Alvarez's suspicions. But with no direct evidence linking Gabriel to the murder weapon, the case was far from airtight. As Alvarez continued to dig, she discovered a crucial piece of evidence. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed Gabriel's car leaving the vicinity of the woods shortly after the estimated time of Isabella's death. The footage directly contradicted Gabriel's statement that he had left earlier, further unraveling his shaky alibi. With the evidence mounting, Alvarez brought Gabriel in for a second round of questioning. This time, Gabriel's composure broke completely. Faced with the overwhelming proof of his lies, Gabriel finally confessed. He tearfully recounted the events of that night, admitting that he had struck Isabella in a moment of rage. He had never intended to kill her, he claimed, but once it happened, he panicked and fled, hoping the whole thing would somehow disappear. Gabriel's confession sent shockwaves through the community. The affair, which had been a carefully guarded secret, was now public, devastating both families. Marisa was left reeling, grappling with the dual betrayal of her husband's infidelity and his role in her cousin's death. The once close-knit families were torn apart by the fallout, and the neighborhood, once seen as a safe haven, was now overshadowed by tragedy. The confession was the beginning of the end for Gabriel Perez, but it was far from the end of the ordeal for those left behind. As news of his arrest spread, the community struggled to come to terms with the truth. Gabriel's actions had shattered more than just lives. They had fractured a once close neighborhood, leaving everyone questioning how such a tragedy could happen right under their noses. In the days following his arrest, Gabriel was charged with second-degree murder. The prosecution wasted no time in building their case, piecing together the damning evidence of Gabriel's affair with Isabella and the violent argument that led to her death. The surveillance footage, phone records, and his own confession painted a clear picture of a man driven by a toxic mix of passion, anger, and desperation. Carlos was devastated. The loss of Isabella was unbearable, but the added betrayal of her affair with Gabriel cut even deeper. He had loved Isabella, flaws and all, and now he was left alone to pick up the pieces of their broken family. His children, too young to fully understand, asked questions that Carlos couldn't bring himself to answer. All he could do was try to be strong for them, even as his own world crumbled around him. Marissa, reeling from the double blow of losing her cousin and her marriage, filed for divorce immediately. She refused to visit Gabriel in jail, unable to even look at the man who had betrayed her so deeply. The life they had built together, once filled with love and laughter, was now a painful memory she wanted to forget. Marissa moved out of their home, taking her children and whatever remained of her dignity, and left the neighborhood that now felt like a graveyard of broken promises. The trial of Gabriel Perez began in July 2019, drawing intense media attention. Reporters filled the courtroom, eager to document every detail of the sordid affair and the shocking crime that followed. The prosecution laid out a timeline of events, emphasizing how Gabriel's affair with Isabella had spiraled into an unthinkable act of violence. They portrayed him as a man who couldn't handle the unraveling of his secret life and chose murder as a means to silence his lover. Gabriel's defense team tried to argue that the death was unintentional, painting the incident as a tragic accident fueled by heightened emotions. They claimed Gabriel never planned to harm Isabella, but his actions in the heat of the moment had devastating consequences. However, the jury saw through the defense's attempts to soften the impact of Gabriel's actions. The evidence was overwhelming, and the emotional testimonies from Carlos and Marissa only solidified the jury's view of Gabriel's guilt. Carlos took the stand, his voice breaking as he described finding his home empty that fateful morning and the agony of learning his wife had been having an affair with his best friend. His pain was palpable, each word heavy with sorrow and betrayal. Marissa's testimony was equally heartbreaking. She spoke of her disbelief at discovering her husband's double life and the unbearable loss of her closest confidant. Their stories highlighted the true cost of Gabriel's actions, not just the loss of Isabella's life, but the destruction of two families bound by love and forever torn apart by tragedy. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Gabriel Perez was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. The sentence brought little comfort to those he had hurt. For Carlos, Marissa, and their children, no amount of time behind bars could ever make up for what they had lost. With the trial over, the once vibrant neighborhood struggled to heal. Carlos sold the family home, unable to bear the constant reminders of what had happened. He moved with his children to a new town, hoping to start fresh, away from the painful memories. Marissa too sought solace in a new beginning, dedicating herself to raising her children and slowly rebuilding her life piece by piece. The tragedy of Isabella Martinez's death and Gabriel Perez's betrayal became a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors long after the headlines faded. It served as a grim reminder of how easily secrets can spiral out of control, leading to irreversible consequences. The affair that was meant to be a hidden passion had instead torn apart families and left a lingering scar on everyone involved. The case of Isabella's murder was a stark lesson in the dangers of deceit and the devastating power of unchecked emotions. In the end, it was not just a story of an affair gone wrong, but a testament to the fragile nature of human relationships and the heavy price of betrayal.